If you enjoy dark and twisted stories, you're in the right place. Tonight, we'll dive into a tale that will make you shiver. Before we start, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss a single spine-tingling tale. Welcome to Sinister Stories, where the shadows hold more than just secrets. In addition to the fact that I've always preferred night work because of the quiet hours and the solitude, I'm not a people person, and the prospect of exploring an abandoned theme park under the stars was strangely alluring. I took the night security job at JOYLAND Carnival on a whim. It was an off-season position meant to last only through the winter while the park underwent renovations and an equipment upgrade. The park had been around for decades, tucked away on the edge of town near a small lake. It was the kind of place that was bursting with life in the summer and felt like a ghost town in the winter. Rides that would have been filled with screams and laughter stood silent, their bright colors dulled in the moonlight. The whole place had an eerie beauty to it at night, the way the roller coaster's tracks twisted up into the sky like skeletal hands reaching out for something. It felt still like it was holding its breath. On my first night, I met Mr. Davidson, the park's manager. He was an older man, probably in his mid-60s, with graying hair and a face that looked worn from years of long shifts and the pressures of running the place. As he walked me around the empty park, showing me my route and the key locations, he spoke in a low, gruff voice that barely broke the silence. "Listen," he said, stopping near the carousel, "there are some things you need to keep in mind during your shifts here. This place isn't like the others. It's got a history, some of it good, some of it not so much. Just follow the rules and you'll be fine." I laughed and dismissed it, saying things like, "Don't ride the Ferris wheel alone and make sure the clowns don't escape." Instead of laughing, he gave me a small piece of worn paper with the words "faded ink" written on it. It was folded and creased as if it had been opened and reopened 100 times. "Rules for nighttime security." Below is a list of instructions in the same antiquated script. "Rules for nighttime security: avoid looking at the carousel directly between 1 and 3 a.m. The list seemed ridiculous, and I laughed again, expecting him to say it was a joke. But when I looked up, Davidson's face was grim, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something. "Worry, fear, do not do," he said, his voice low. "If you hear carnival music, follow it to the entrance and wait until it stops. And if someone dressed as a clown waves at you, turn around and leave." With a firm handshake and a final reminder to check the list whenever I felt uneasy, Davidson left me. I watched him go, his figure vanishing into the darkness beyond the park gates, and then I turned to look at the paper in my hand. The first rule felt harmless enough: never look directly at the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. I turned to look at the vibrant carousel. The park was quiet and still, with an unnatural silence settling deep into the empty spaces between the rides and food stalls. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, towering over the park like a watchful eye. I felt a slight chill, but I told myself it was just the cool night air seeping through my jacket. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I started my rounds. Even in the dim light, the horses were lined up in a silent parade, frozen in mid-gallop, their manes captured in a permanent wave, and their glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I passed. It was eerie at night. The hours went very slowly as I strolled along deserted paths, the only sounds being the crunch of dirt beneath my feet and the sporadic creak of an ancient tree swinging in the wind at midnight. I stopped and looked at my phone's clock when I was back close to the carousel. I had no trouble following the restrictions, which stated that I couldn't gaze at it after 1 a.m., so I chose to keep walking and stay along the park's perimeter, where the woods began to creep up close to the fences. My thoughts began to stray, pulled to the oddities of the place, the aging rides. The park seems to have been waiting, clinging to its past like a memory that would not go away at one point, as depicted in the faded posters. The fun house was bright and cheerful during the day, with a cartoonish face painted above the entrance. However, in the dim light, it appeared different, almost sinister. The colors had faded, and the once smiling face appeared to have turned into a leer. I foolishly wanted to go inside and explore the winding hallways to see what was at the end, but rule number 3 kept coming to mind, so I laughed and pushed the urge away. As I continued my patrol, I noticed that the clown statues were strewn throughout the park. They were remnants of the park's early years, dressed in gaudy, vintage costumes, and frozen in a perpetual wave or a cheerful grin. There was something unnerving about their painting. After all, I was alone in a deserted theme park at night, so who wouldn't feel a little shaky? Smiles appeared a bit too broad and too rigid, and the final rule, that if someone in a clown costume waves at you, turn around and leave, was absurd. Who would be in a clown costume here at this hour? I shook my head, dismissing the odd list once more, claiming it was just an old security guard's joke and a collection of superstitions. I kept telling myself, leave behind to spook the newbies, as I walked back to the door. As I stood there listening to the silence, a faint sound crept through the air, the far-off tinkling notes of carnival tunes. Every hair on my body stood on edge, and I froze as I grabbed for the list in my pocket and unfolded it with shaking fingers. It was a faint melody that appeared to come from someplace deep within the park. Rule number 2: if you hear carnival music, follow it to the entrance and wait until it stops. The music was growing louder, filling the air with a tune that was both cheerful and haunting. I forced myself to move to follow the path back to the entrance, my footsteps quick and uneven. The music continued echoing through the empty park, a haunting melody that seemed to wrap around me, drawing me in. When I reached the entrance, I stopped, glancing around as the music continued to play, faint but persistent. I waited, my pulse quickening, until finally the music faded, trailing off into silence. I let out a shaky breath, glancing down at the list in my hand. The rules had seemed like nonsense at first, a silly joke meant to unsettle me, but now, standing alone in the dark, I wasn't so sure. Something about the park felt different, as if it had come alive, aware of my presence. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the park was watching me. By dawn, I'd almost convinced myself that the whole thing had been in my head, just nerves playing tricks on me. But that morning, lying in bed, the faint strains of carnival music, a faint sense of unease gnawed at me as I went back to the park the next night. But I told myself it was nothing, that the music had likely come from a forgotten speaker or an automated system that had accidentally turned on. It was the kind of tune that you couldn't forget even if you wanted to. The notes ed twisting around in my head as I fell asleep. As I made my rounds, I mentally repeated this. With my flashlight beam piercing the darkness, I could feel the chill of the night seeping into my bones. I carried the rules list in my pocket, occasionally rubbing my fingertips against the frayed paper as if it might somehow shield me. I had considered breaking the rules, possibly even testing them, but the recollection of that song and how it had woven itself through the void as I passed the carousel park held me back. I looked at my phone's clock. 12:55, with 5 minutes until the first regulation took effect. I understood I didn't want to be near the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m. A shiver of dread went down my spine. At precisely 1 o'clock, I decided to turn around and circle the park to give the carousel a broad berth, but while I was walking, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't right. I heard a faint sound that sounded like gears starting to turn, and my heart skipped a beat. I looked back, half expecting to see the carousel start up on its own, but the horses were still frozen in mid-gallop, their glassy eyes staring blankly into the night. I tried to look away to keep moving forward, but I couldn't help but stare at them. The rule slipped from my mind as the worrying sound grew louder. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me, filling my ears with a low hum that made it difficult to think. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt slightly as I approached the edge of the platform. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the spell, and I jolted, pulling myself back and quickly turning away. I forced myself to ignore the carousel as I walked quickly across the park, and even as the worrying sound subsided into silence, I dared not turn around when my phone buzzed once more and a message appeared on the screen. It was from Davidson, the park manager, and it said, "Follow the rules." Those 3 words sent a shiver down my spine. How could Davidson have known that I hadn't told him about my shift or that I had ever thought about breaking the rules? I stuffed my phone into my pocket again. As I made my rounds, my hand shook a little, but I kept my eyes focused forward. The air seemed strange, and the park was more still than ever, as if the rides themselves were watching and waiting for something to happen. Just after 2 in the morning, I could practically hear the Ferris wheel groaning softly, sounding uncannily like a sigh, as it loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the night sky, its empty seats swaying gently in the breeze. When I went by the fun house, the cartoonish face that was painted over the entryway was still there. I felt a strange urge to enter and walk through the dimly lit halls to see what lay at the end, but the rule that echoed in my mind, "Do not enter the fun house alone," made me shudder. The door creaked slightly in the breeze and swung open just a crack as if inviting me inside. I turned away, making myself return to the main route. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me leave, but all I saw was the funhouse's gaping entrance with its twisted grin mocking me. My footsteps echoed in the silence, each one feeling heavier as if the ground itself were pulling me down. As I went about my rounds, the silence grew thicker around me. As my flashlight pierced the night, I considered Davidson's message and how, as if he were observing from outside the park gates, he had known exactly what I had been doing. As the clock approached 3 in the morning, I looked at my phone once more, almost expecting to see another message, but the screen was dark. I went back to the doorway, excited to wrap up my shift. As I was about to return to my chair, a faint sound drifted through the air, the distant strains of carnival music, and I took a long breath to attempt to get rid of the lingering uneasiness. My blood ran cold, and I reached for the list in my pocket, unfolding it with quivering fingers. Second rule: if you hear carnival music, go to the door and wait for it to cease. I had to keep my composure to follow the directions even as the music got louder and filled the air with a melancholic song. The melody was slow, almost melancholy, with each note lingering in the air before fading. I stood there listening to my heart race as the music reverberated through the deserted park in a sound that didn't belong. I looked around, expecting to see lights flickering on the ride, coming to life in some terrifying display, but the park was still, the ride was motionless, and the only movement was the soft sway of the Ferris wheel in the distance. The music kept winding its way through the air, a melody that seemed oddly familiar, as if I had heard it before. My phone buzzed again, and I looked down, half expecting to see another message from Davidson, but the screen was blank, and when I looked up, the music had stopped. The silence that enveloped me was complete stillness. My heart was racing as the reality of the rules set in. They weren't just guidelines, they were warnings and boundaries designed to keep me safe from whatever lurked in the shadows of Lakeside Carnival. They filled my ears with a ringing that wouldn't go away. I looked around, scanning the darkened rides, the deserted stalls, and the rows of clown statues. Cold for the first time in perpetual cheer, I had the impression that the park itself was alive and aware of my presence, watching me from every angle. Just then, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, and my heart raced, but I saw nothing. The shadows appeared to be shifting into odd shapes, but they quickly disappeared when I tried to concentrate on them. I inhaled deeply, telling myself that the darkness was only deceiving me, but my uneasiness only increased. A knot of fear began to form in my gut, and I stopped when I heard gravel crunching and heard footsteps echoing in the stillness, suggesting that someone or something was approaching me. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the sound, the beam swaying a little, but the footsteps ceased and the darkness engulfed whatever had been there. A shiver went down my spine, and I looked back at the entrance, suddenly wanting to leave to get away from the park's strange pull, but my shift wasn't over, and I knew I couldn't leave until dawn. I steadied myself by taking a long breath, and I forced myself to ignore the shadows that appeared to be closing in on me as I went about my rounds. As I moved through the park, the weight of the silence weighed heavily on me. The rides towered like tall skeletons, their frames twisted and shadowed, each standing as a silent witness to the strange occurrences of the night. Despite my best efforts to remain calm, an unsettling realization settled over me. The rules felt heavier now, their words echoing in my mind a reminder that there were forces at work in the park that I couldn't understand. I could feel their presence lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to make a mistake. As I continued my patrol, a peculiar compulsion developed within of me that I couldn't ignore. It was almost as if the park itself were directing me along twisting trails past the quiet game booths and deserted food stalls. This place was watching and waiting, and somehow it knew every move I made. I wanted to go back to get out of the maze of shadows, but something pushed me forward, an unsaid demand, because the familiar layout felt warped, the passageways stretching farther and twisting in ways I couldn't quite recall. As I got closer to the carousel, the pull intensified, whispering at the corners of my mind. Before I knew it, I was only a few feet away, pulled by an inexplicable power. The horses remained motionless, their glassy eyes staring at me with their once playful expressions. I swallowed hard, frozen in something that suddenly felt like hatred, remembering that the first rule was to never gaze directly at the carousel between 1 and 3 a.m., but it was too late. I noticed a flash of light and turned to see the carousel coming to life. The platform started to rotate, each horse bobbing up and down in a languid, ethereal procession, and the faint sound of gears filled the air before the steady creak of metal. I tried to turn away, but my eyes were fixed on the carousel, caught in the rhythmic rise and fall of the horses. As the music began gently, just a whisper of a tune, then it became louder, filling the air with a melody that was both haunting and oddly familiar. I wanted to turn and run to get away from the pull of the music and the carousel, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. Suddenly, I saw something move between the horses, a shadowed, indistinct figure darting in and out of sight as the platform spun. I blinked, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, but the figure continued to move with the same slow, steady rhythm as the horses. My pulse quickened, and I realized that I was seeing something forbidden, something I shouldn't have seen. When I realized it was observing me, my breath seized in my throat. I saw a face with a faint painted smile, eyes that were black and hollow, and a tinge of red around the lips as the figure moved closer, its gaze piercing the darkness and slipping between the horses with an ease that defied logic. The features were warped and the makeup was smudged. A clown's smile was twisted into one that was overly big and hollow. My heart pounded when I recalled the final rule: if a clown waved at you, turn around and leave, but I was immobile. With one hand lifted in a slow, deliberate wave, the clown walked forward, its smile expanding and stretching unnaturally across its face. I took a step back, my heart racing, but the clown continued to approach, swerving between the horses as it got closer, and the carousel accelerated. I muttered, my voice barely audible, "Please just stop," as the music grew louder and the notes blurred into a discordant melody that filled my head and drowned out my thoughts. The horses were bobbing faster, their eyes sparkling in the dark light. For a moment, the clown stopped, its eyes locked on mine, and I thought it would listen and stop, but then it moved again, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It was only a few feet away, its hand still up in that mocking wave, its painted smile stretching into a leer. I staggered backward, the weight of my fear pressing down on me, making it difficult for me to breathe. Even though the clown's eyes were dark and vacant, I could still feel their relentless, frigid stare piercing me. I attempted to turn away in an attempt to break the spell, but my eyes were fixed on its face, stuck in the terrible, warped smile. "Why have you come here?" I was able to tremble and whisper, "What do you want?" The clown's eyes seemed to gleam their mouths as they turned into snars, and their glassy eyes were fixed on me. The clown's head tilted as if it was thinking about my question, its smile widening, and it raised a hand pointing at me, its finger held steady accusing, and then it spoke in a whisper that seemed to echo in the empty park. I took another step back, my heart pounding, and the carousel spun faster, the music building to a feverish pitch that filled the air with a maddening, endless tune. I briefly looked back and saw the clown standing at the edge of the carousel, watching me with the same sarcastic smile. Its hand was still up, slowly waving, and its painted eyes were glinting in the darkness. I forced myself to look away and concentrate on the path ahead, desperate to get out of the park's clutches. The exit was just ahead, with the gates looming like a dark silhouette against the night sky. I strained every muscle in my body to get closer, but as soon as I got to the entrance, the music stopped. The silence was so overwhelming that it pressed down on me, filling the area where the music had been. I stopped, gasping for air, and I looked around the dark park, which was still filled with rides. Cold. I took a step forward, then another, and kept my eyes on the gate, but as I got to the exit, I noticed a flash of movement. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned to see a figure standing a few feet away, half hidden in the shadows. It was a clown, with a twisted smile painted on its face and dark, empty eyes. It raised a hand slowly, its grin widening as it stepped closer. "No," I whispered, shaking my head back, "no," and the clown took another step, its eyes fixed on mine. Unchanging and frozen, I staggered backward, breathing difficultly due to the weight of the quiet weighing down on me and my racing heart. As the park watched and waited, I could feel the excitement in the air. I turned and hurried, my footsteps resonating through the quiet, and I couldn't get the clown's smile out of my head. The park felt like it was winding around me. The extended route winds in odd, unfeasible directions. I sprinted past the fun house, the Ferris wheel, and the carousel, each of which loomed like a silent sentinel watching me with icy, unblinking eyes. As I staggered past the fun house, I felt the impulse to go inside and face whatever was there, but the faint reminder of the boundaries held me back. The laughter, which began as a faint echo in the distance, became louder and filled the air with a hollow mocking sound, making it impossible for me to cross. I looked around quickly through the darkness, but there was nobody there, just the empty. I ran faster, my legs burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed myself toward the exit, but as I got to the gates, a hand grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back. The park was silent and waiting, and the laughter grew, blending with the distant strains of carnival music. The sound twisted and distorted, filling my mind with a creeping dread. I turned around and saw the clown standing right in front of me. Its painted smile stretched unnaturally wide, and its eyes gleamed with a cold, emotionless light. "You broke the rules," it said, its voice a quiet hiss that disturbed the stillness. I shouted, jerked away, and staggered through the gates as the chilly night air swept over me like a wave. I raced until I was well out of the park, the laughter and music fading. In the distance, I dared not turn around since the clown's smile was ingrained in my memory. The park, even as I slowed to a walk, I had the feeling that something was following me just out of sight. I looked back over my shoulder, expecting to see the painted face of the clown in the shadows, but the streets were deserted by the time I arrived at my apartment. Gates swung shut behind me with a creak that seemed to echo through the empty streets. I continued running until the park's lights had faded into the distance, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind reeling with images of the night. I stumbled inside, my hands shaking, and closed the door behind me, thinking that this simple barrier would shield me from whatever had persisted in the park. I wanted to think that the horrors were behind me, but a heaviness that I couldn't get rid of settled in my chest. I tried to go to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clown's face with its big smile and hollow eyes watching me with a look that felt uncanny. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the night over and over again, the rules, the music, the carousel, all of which served as a reminder that something in the park had felt alive and aware, as though it were testing the limits of my fear. The following morning, I called the park's main office in the hopes of reaching Davidson to inform him that I couldn't go back and that I was finished, but the receptionist's calm and detached voice told me that there was no one named Davidson working there. I insisted, explaining that he was the manager, that he had hired me a few days prior, but she just repeated herself, her tone growing colder and farther away. I hung up with a hollow ache in my chest. A memory slipping through my fingers, I searched my pockets for the list of rules I'd carried with me through the night, but my pockets were empty. The paper was gone as though it had never existed. The days passed slowly, each one bleeding into the next. I stopped sleeping, the memories of the night filling my thoughts with a persistent creeping unease. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow held a thread. At night, I would catch faint strains of carnival music drifting through the air, a haunting melody that seemed to come from nowhere. I would sit up listening, my heart racing, waiting for the music to fade, but the tune lingered, filling the silence with a hollow mocking sound. And then one night I heard it, the soft rhythmic tapping, the same sound that had followed me through the park. I froze, my heart pounding as the tapping grew louder, closer, until it was just outside my window. I held my breath, the weight of the silence pressing down on me, the memories of the clown's painted smile filling my mind. Slowly I turned my gaze, drifting to the window where the glass reflected a distorted version of my room. For a moment, I saw nothing, just my own face staring back at me, whitey and pale. But then in the reflection a figure appeared, standing just behind me, half hidden in shadow. The face was painted in a wide grin, eyes dark and hollow, one hand raised in a slow, deliberate wave. My heart began to race, but the room was deserted. The image vanished, leaving only the faint sounds of carnival music, a melody that persisted long after everyone had stopped talking. I appreciate you watching these terrifying tales. Please remember to like, subscribe, and share the story if you liked it. Your support helps the channel grow and enables me to continue producing the terrifying stories you love. Spread the fright and have a great evening.